Hello. Welcome, everybody. Can you hear me? Great. I'm Annalisa Castle with the Alliance for the Great Lakes. And you just heard French-Chilean rapper Ana Tijoux with Shadia Mansour performing their song, Somos Sur. As our panelists get their mics and their video rolling, I am going to just let you all know that I'm calling in from Chicago as all our panelists, and I want to just start with a land acknowledgement. Chicago sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and Odawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois, and today one of the largest urban American Indian communities in the United States resides in Chicago. Members of this community continue to contribute to the life of this city, to celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for land and waterways. I also would like to offer a language acknowledgement today. I want to recognize some of the limitations that we have in terms of how we talk about ourselves, which can be another form of structural racism. First, we're speaking in English about Latinx leadership, when so many of the Latina leaders who we honor in our practice do not speak English or speak languages other than English. Additionally, we're wrapping up Hispanic Heritage Month, which is recognized as such by the federal government. But Hispanic means Spanish ancestry, right? It's derivative, it's from Spain. It erases indigeneity and African roots, and it is often excluded. It often excludes or is misapplied to many people within the diaspora, including the entire country of Brazil. Latino, meaning Latin American origin or ancestry, is sometimes used as an alternative. We increasingly see Latinx as a way to remove gender from that term, but that in itself is a very American construct. And so while we acknowledge the limitations of the language we have available to us, I also want to set our conversation off with the understanding that we assume goodwill and we are committing to respecting the way that we articulate ourselves. So with that, I want to say welcome again. The Alliance for the Great Lakes, your host today, is a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to the health of the Great Lakes and a clean water future for all in our region. We believe that social, racial, and economic justice are inseparable from environmental justice. And we know that we cannot actualize our vision of a Great Lakes enjoyed by all and a thriving Great Lakes region without the leadership of women of color and local leaders on the ground. And so today I'm really excited. We're going to hear from 4 really incredible women, all from Chicago's southeast side, where the Calumet River meets Lake Michigan. But of course, their impact extends well beyond that area of the city and the city limits itself. And before getting started with our panelists, I want to quickly shout out Luz Gomez and Daniel Duggan from my team at the Alliance, who are helping make sure that this hour runs smoothly through all the work behind the scenes. I want to give our audience a heads up that you'll be muted just to avoid background noise and distractions out of respect for this shared space. But you can go ahead and submit questions using the Q&A function. And I'm going to start us off with questions for our panelists before taking audience questions. So without further ado, thank you to our incredible panelists for being with us today. I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves and give your pronouns as you respond to this first question. So let's begin. November 3rd is right around the corner. It is a time when pundits talk in terms of demographics. We hear a lot about the Latino vote, like we're a monolith. We also, as the Alliance for the Great Lakes, and most of you have some limitations on what we can talk about here today. We cannot endorse or oppose candidates or specific legislation. So let's really focus on the issues. We know there's a ton at stake. Of course, we're talking about the largest public health crisis in living memory, which has hit our communities particularly hard. we're talking about the proper response to that crisis. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about funding for water infrastructure. We're talking about migration, both in terms of people crossing borders, but also people fleeing climate crisis. We're talking about climate refugees who have been devastated by fires and floods. And we're also not just talking about the top of the ticket, right? We're talking down ballot. We're talking about the way that all of these issues and more impact us from the federal to the local level. So with that, can each of you please introduce yourselves, your pronouns, and share briefly what's at stake this November?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you to, we have over 100 people. We have 100 people on the call now, so that's really exciting to see folks are tuning in. And I'm Olga Baltista. I'm with the Alliance for the Great Lakes, and I live in the southeast side of Chicago. And this is a really good question for me. I think for a long time, like we have seen so many marginalized communities who just doesn't matter like what, if it's like who's in office, like their situation of poverty is impacting them, and they don't get involved in politics. I think that they don't vote because it's the same, either it doesn't matter who wins. And for a lot of people, and I'm thinking that, like, you know, there's been a lot of folks who have been really moved recently because of all of the because of what's at stake, because of the uprisings that we have seen regarding Black Lives Matter crisis, and also the pandemic. I mean, I was just joking earlier about, like, I saw a tweet by Snoop Dogg that he's registered to vote and voting for the first time in his life. And I'm hoping that that rings true for a lot of other people. And I like to hear what other folks think.
Hi, this is Gina Ramirez. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Just professionally and personally, I'm always thinking about climate change, especially with the heat waves that are going on and the devastating fires. And so, you know, I really kind of tie it back to being a person who lives in a frontline community who's constantly pushed up by polluters, under-resourced, underinvested, and over-policed. And when it comes to climate change and extreme weather and flooding and heat, it exacerbates those problems. So I really think that we need to continuously think about that, especially during this election season, in order to find solutions to make recovery from these climate challenges achievable.
I can go next. Hi, everyone. I'm Angela Tovar. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Chicago. And Annalisa, I think that you mentioned a number of things that we're facing collectively as a city, as a state, as a country, and globally as well. And I want to just add a couple of more things that I think are going to be challenges in the coming year. And that is budget shortfalls, right, on the city, on the county, and on the state level, and then also just the lack of and availability of federal funding, right? And as we're thinking of this from a water policy perspective, and just how some of those sources of funding have just dried up over the course of the years. But this is also a time, right, when, as you mentioned, and as we're talking about just deep and systemic racial inequities that have been here for a long time, that are finally exposed. And as Olga mentioned, right, people are taking their demands to the street and demanding more. And I think that voting is certainly a way in which we can, you know, demand better outcomes and to align ourselves with people who are supporting the vision that we want to see from our community. And then beyond that, I think that this call in the streets is really a signal to policymakers, right? That we have to build better policy, that we have to factor in all of these variables, and that we're building, right, solutions to create more resilient communities, communities that are more informed, more engaged, more connected, that we're finding solutions to provide the economic relief that people need. and that we are, as we are thinking about investments, that we create like clean and sustainable outcomes in different sectors for folks. And then I think this year, especially more than others, has just underscored the need just to put the health and well-being of people first as we're facing this pandemic. And so as I'm moving forward, as someone, you know, who works on the city level on the policy team, that's certainly something that I hold and that, you know, I know is sort of how I need to march forward. And I think that that is something that, you know, we need to demand of our elected officials in this election and beyond as well.
Yeah, my name is Lena Avalos. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a freshman at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and I'm also work with Illinois Youth Climate Movement and NRDC with Gina and the People's Lobby. So I think there's so much at stake with this election particularly, and I think it's also a good reminder that this election isn't only a presidential election. There's referendums, there's judges, there's so many other positions that are so important that we educate ourselves on and vote for. And we're voting in minds of, one, people who can't vote, incarcerated individuals, felons, and undocumented people who live in this country and get the same resources from the government. And also we're voting keeping in mind that every problem we see in terms of climate change, environmental racism, anything like police brutality, things like that, they're all coming from within the same system. And we need to vote and work as hard as we can to reform and bring down that system. So I think that's very important, and it's super important with this election here in Illinois particularly. And so thank you for having me.
Wonderful, thanks. I feel like this is going to be a good conversation. So I want to take us to sort of the theme of this call, right? Water, women, and wellness. The Alliance for the Great Lakes has hosted conversations like this in other places, including in Ohio, where we really explored the connection between how women and our wellness is impacted by water. And by that, we mean the water that we drink, the water that big rains send into our homes as floods or basement backups, the health and the safety of the water we use for recreation along the lakes and rivers with our families. So let's talk for a minute about what water, and especially in the context of water, women, and wellness, means to you personally and or in your work.
This is Angela. I can go first. Thank you for that question, Annalisa. You know, it's so interesting. I think about water all the time, and I just think about the, you know, the important role that water has played in my life. And even, you know, I know that we're all from the Southeast side, so I think a lot about just like the way that water has shaped our community and like how important water, like the important way and like the important part of our history that water has played for Indigenous people in Chicago, for the industry in Chicago, and for, you know, it's a huge part of Mexican American history, at least on the Southeast side, right? I mean, we're here because Chicago is a portage, right? It's the confluence of this river system and then the Great Lakes, and, you know, people settled here. You know, the indigenous people and beyond have settled here because of just the opportunities that navigating between this river system and the Great Lakes has played. And it's no different for, you know, Latinx communities in Chicago as well. You know, the Southeast side and the large influx of the Mexican American population came about because of the need to service the steel industry and beyond, you know, and many of our ancestors came to Chicago via barge, right, up the rivers from Mexico to Chicago. And so I think about that. And I also think about the outcomes, right? And I think that there is a reason why every single woman on this panel is from the same neighborhood and we're all in the environmental justice space. I think that, you know, we've lived through this transition from industry, right, and just the economic downturn of our community. And I think that we all see the value and the opportunities of what a just transition to a more sustainable economy can provide our community. And I think that we carry that with us. And, you know, and that doesn't surprise me. I think that we're all, you know, women typically, on average, are just more likely, right, to volunteer in their communities. And so I think when, you know, lack of access to water as a resource, like we lived in a neighborhood where water was abundant, yet we didn't have access to it in the same way, right? It just in terms of like, when you think of all of the accessible water access that people have on the lake throughout Chicago, and then you just get to the southeast side, right? And then it just kind of falls off and then it picks back up again. And there, you know, so it's no surprise to me that every single person on this panel, every single woman on this panel has taken up this fight, and just understanding that even though the water was abundant, there is certainly lack of access, and that there are additional issues with water, just in terms of urban flooding, you know, just in terms of infrastructure, and also just thinking about I would say just like the role that women play in our households in terms of how much unpaid work we take on, right? You know, people commonly refer to that as the second shift when you get home from your workday, you know, what you take on. So to me, as like caretakers of our homes and also our communities, you know, it's not surprising that we're all here, that we're in this space and are fighting for very similar outcomes, I think, for our communities. And I think that that has sort of defined, right? Water has played a tremendous role in shaping who I am. And I think that this movement as well.
Yeah, to me, I think water is it's just super important just as an environmentalist, and also just like Angela said, growing up here on the southeast side, you know, my dad and I always joke about how we live on an island because the Calumet River borders around us and we can't leave or enter our neighborhood without crossing a bridge or some train tracks. And water has always just played such an important role, like just in general, going to Lake Michigan to swim, you know, walking across the Chicago River, seeing things like that. And it's very devastating knowing that something that was at one point, like just less than 200 years ago, was so abundant, clean, able to drink, swim in, you know, be able to use to whoever is available, and then turned into something that's one, dirty and it's necessary to be filtered, necessary to be cleaned, and two, monetized by the city, by other things, which I think water is like a basic human right. And we also see that within the past couple of years with the Dakota Access Pipeline, people are fighting and putting their lives on the line just for the bare necessity of access to clean water. And that's something I also think that also brings up like my thoughts around Indigenous, Black, Latino communities. We have been the ones always fighting for the environment, fighting for our homes, and we're not really seeing that turnout. And that's really something that holds heavy in my heart, and also just inspires like the work I do, and I know inspires the other women, the work we do for, you know, just for our communities here on the southeast side.
Thanks. I want to hear from Olga and Gina as well, but I want to stay on this topic of water, women, and wellness, but from the perspective also of personal well-being and sustainability in the work. And Angela, I think you started to take us there a little bit, but I know all of you are fighting on several fronts at once and taking care of yourselves and your families and your communities while contributing to, you know, really intersectional movements for social, racial, environmental, and climate justice. And that is a heavy lift for anyone. So can you tell us a little bit about like how you strike that balance and like do all the things you need to do while also staying buoyant for the long haul?
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in here. It's hard. You know, it's like a decision that we make. I think everybody on this panel made, like, I'm gonna sacrifice a lot of things, right? To be present in the campaigns that are going on in our communities, to also provide political analysis of like why we're in the situations that we're in. And that takes a lot of time and care to make sure that we're reaching the right people, that we're making space for that. And then our circles, you know, our friends, you know, end up being the same movement folks that are there to help. I mean, Annalisa, you helped me, you know, babysit my eldest daughter when I wanted to go to the budget hearings for the city, you know, and we had just met. And like, I mean, I think that's how like women show up for each other. And also making it accessible for families, for women who have children to be part of these campaigns takes a lot of care. You know, I think a lot of people would feel like it's cumbersome, you know, to be like facilitating a meeting with like a baby on your hip, but literally that's how we got rid of piles of pet coke, you know, by meeting at people's front stoops, talking about it, you know, door knocking, you know, pushing a stroller with one hand and handing out leaflets with the other. And it's a decision that we made to stay in this fight. And it's just really interesting to me too, like how like with the pandemic, how like these networks that we had already started to work around with the Academy Connect partnership, the work that I do with the Alliance for the Great Lakes, that we had already started to unsilo a lot of the work that was happening in the community by bringing in folks who were working on an array of issues that were all to improve the quality of life in the community, you know, for the residents of the community, but we weren't actually like working together. And those groups, just because we had already been working together, when the pandemic hit, that was the group that got together and started a COVID response network that was bringing volunteers to the food pantries in our community that are mostly, like the volunteers are mostly elderly folks, people who are retired. So it was a danger for them to be out. So a lot of young people were able to fill in that gap and that need. And amongst other things that that has happened through that effort. But I think that's how we stay, you know, in the fight, and also try to avoid burnout, you know, but sometimes we have to take a pause and making sure that there are leaders that can carry the torch so that the work doesn't end, and that some of us can take a step back at different times of our lives is extremely important so that we can actually sustain the movements that are happening here.
Yeah, I can add a little bit more, just sort of echoing what Olga said. It is very hard to stay buoyant, especially if you're working full time, a mother, and then you spend your evenings at like community meetings with your child. I was kind of raised that way though, you know, everyone always says it takes a village to raise a child, and I love the term other mothering. So I feel like with Olga especially, you know, like she's another mother to my son. And I think that's really part of the fabric here of this neighborhood, and identifying as a Mexican woman. You know, I had like my aunts and family friends, you know, who would watch me when my mom was at craft shows at church, because that was her source of income when I was younger. So it really is a women's movement too. You'll notice on a lot of frontline issues, it's mostly women who are doing this work. And I think it's because we're trying to prevent this from happening so that our children aren't spending their evenings learning about, you know, what is manganese. I always say, like, I never went to school. I hate science. Why do I even know what the term manganese is, or all of these heavy metals and their impacts on my neurological system? I'd much rather be teaching my son how to ride a bike in the evenings instead of, you know, showing up to community meetings and talking to reporters in my free time. So, you know, it is really hard to not get burned out. And I think what is so amazing that we're seeing on the Southeast side is this youth movement and people like Adelina who aren't waiting until they become mothers to like become an environmentalist, that they're noticing it at a young age and they're doing something now so that, you know, future generations, their children, they won't have to, you know, they'll be able to take their kid for a bike ride in the evening and they won't have to attend these community meetings, hopefully.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really powerful. Thank you all for sharing. I want to turn us a little bit deeper into this conversation around environmental justice and race. Of course, when we're talking about environmental justice, we're talking about racial and social justice too. And we often hear the phrase in this work, Black and Latino, but it's not a binary, right? There are, of course, Black Latinos. And at the same time, there are experiences that are specific to Mexican Americans, to Latinos, who are immigrants or children of immigrants, to the Black community and more. And it's important to note, right, that anti-Black racism exists within the Latinx community, as do efforts around Black-Brown solidarity. And so I want to explore that in the context of water justice work, right? And also just this past year, when the COVID pandemic has really wreaked havoc on communities of color. We've seen the violent murder and abuse of people of color at the hands of the state, from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor to Vanessa Guillen to family separation. And we've also seen an uprising and reckoning all over this country around race and you know, where we're all at. So I'm curious if you could all just tell us, how has this like current context challenged you both personally and in the work that you do to think critically about systemic racism and how it shows up for you, and also how it challenges you to articulate maybe a different vision or a reinvigorated vision for the world that you're working to build? That's open to anybody who'd like to answer that.
I could take a stab at it. This is such a deep, like multi-layered question, but you know, I was definitely like made me reconsider my work, especially during the thick of the riots here in Chicago, when basically downtown Chicago was protected and neighborhoods on the south and west sides were kind of left to fend for themselves. And then seeing the racism that has always existed on the southeast side, but seeing it exacerbated, you know, having like gangs defend our Walgreens. It was just horrible. And I always think about this quote during Hurricane Katrina that an activist brought up. It says, "Stop calling me resilient, because every time you say, oh, they're resilient, that means you could do something else to me. I am not resilient." And that kind of just sort of sums up how I feel about like systemic racism and how it intersects with environmental justice, because I feel like you know, the racist land use and zoning policies and just the systemic racism that's persisted in this country, and the fact that people on the south and west sides, Black and brown communities, you know, are supposed to take it because they're resilient and that they could bounce back, that you know, that's a narrative. It's a myth. And so that's sort of really, I've been sitting with that quote this past summer, and I've been sharing it with as many people as I can, especially young people, because you kind of like will believe it after a while, like, oh yeah, well, that's just how it is over here. And it's not the case. We need to change that narrative.
Yeah, I totally agree with Gina, and I think I also been thinking about lately. It's just, you know, we've always known this system has existed and that it's kept Black, brown, Indigenous people down, and it really, I think for me this year, it just really showed me how extremely fragile the system is, and one like grain of sand in a microchip and it all goes insane. Like we saw with this COVID pandemic, that could have been, you know, resolved if we had correct like government regulation, and also just, you know, also Black and brown people being put first in this pandemic, given that we're the ones most vulnerable due to environmental racism and health and like racism in the healthcare system, things like that. And it goes to show that like something like a pandemic can just totally make our country go haywire, and people are going out and people are not going out and things like that, and we just don't know what to do, and it's all because of this same system that puts like toxic like factories and whatever in our community here. So that's been on my mind a lot too lately.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there is a lot there, and I think that topic can be an entire panel on its own. But for now, I think we're going to turn over to a video presentation that highlights, I think, some of the ways that racism shows up in terms of assimilation and identity, and also as a sort of multimedia treat for our audience. So Luz, if you wouldn't mind sharing the video, and then we'll get back into that conversation. Thanks.
My name, when I started kindergarten, was Ramon. And by the time I was in the second grade, everybody was calling me Raymond. You know, out in the playground, in the classroom, Raymond, hey, Raymond, hey, Raymond. And trying to adjust to this, you know what I mean? And if there was a girl named Maria, her name became Mary. And Juanita became Jane. So one day, we got a new student by the name of Facundo Gonzalez. Facundo Gonzalez, man. When he came into school, we noticed they called it an emergency administrative meeting. You kind of hear him talking to the door. What are we going to do with this guy, man? You know what I mean? How are we going to change his name, you know? And one teacher goes, well, you know what? Why don't we try to shorten the name a little bit? And they go, yeah, well, but how do you spell it? Facundo. And they go, well, why don't we just spell it FAC? And one of the teachers, well, that means his name would be Fac. And the other teachers looked at him, no, that sounds too much like a dirty word. You can't be saying Fac. Where's your homework, you know? Where's Fac at, you know what I mean? Well, that was a trip we always remembered going to elementary school because Facundo was the only guy who never got his name changed.
Thank you. That makes me laugh every time, Facundo Gonzalez. And I will share, I come from a mixed family. And I actually have a close relative that changed their last name from Gonzalez to a more Anglo name to sort of take advantage of some of the benefits of passing. And I'm Annalisa, but in second grade, I became Annie. And so I know we all can relate in different ways, but I want to invite Olga to tell us why you chose to share this video.
Well, this is a story that was part of Chuy Negrete, who is an elder from our community, who is a storyteller who tells stories using a popular storytelling songs called corridos in Mexico. And him and Frank Corona would perform with their guitars at different community events. And this story always really resonated with me. And I also just wanted to highlight another Southeast Sider's work and in telling and showing that story. But yeah, as growing up, I actually stopped caring how people said my name because there was 18 variations of my name in one day. And then I was like, no, I'm gonna, speak up and actually let people know this is my name is Olga. And, I will allow certain variations of that, but so some of them I won't. And it's another reminder of, our, how we look at ourselves as women, as Latinas, in the work that we do that is also often, there goes my naughty puppy, is also, just very dominated by oftentimes white men.
Okay, on the topic of representation, I want to take us there, and I think for movement folks, especially Latinas, women of color in the environmental space, that is not dominated by people that look like us. I think it can feel like the more specialized you get in your field or the more advanced you are in your career, the more tensions you have to hold. I think for women of color, sometimes that means you're expected to provide diversity or community voice. and maybe you're not looked to for your issue expertise, or you can't be more than one thing. And that can poison trust, right? If you suspect that you're in a room to provide political cover. So whether it's reflecting on that video or this sort of statement I just shared, I'm wondering, does that resonate with any of you? And if you can reflect on that briefly.
I can offer just some thoughts and a personal story about the video too. You know, I think that the interesting thing culturally, right, on the Southeast side for a long time, like so many of us are, you know, second and third generation Mexican, right? Our parents either came over as immigrants or, you know, in my case, you know, my great grandparents on my maternal side. And so, in just that transition at that time, right, for my mom's family, like in the 50s, assimilation was just like the way that people survived, right? And so there's just so many examples of people just changing their name, right, to sound less ethnic, you know, and just more, you know, I guess like just in a way to assimilate, right? And so, you know, even the way that, you know, our last names are pronounced, I think, on the Southeast side, and that's changing again, right? I think as a new wave of immigration is coming back to the neighborhood, like that's changed. But for a while, you know, people do mispronounce, you know, did and still do. I mean, I pronounced my name historically, like just growing up, like in that assimilation and just being, again, like and on my maternal side, just like third generation, for a long time, people just are like, oh, you're a Tovar, right? Like you're Angela Tovar. And I still, you know, and I changed the pronunciation and just acknowledging that in all of my other Spanish speaking words, I take the time to pronounce that, but sometimes I just revert back to just like that just way that people have just decided that this is the pronunciation of my last name, you know. And I think that that just speaks to how important representation is, particularly in leadership. Just going back to your question, I'll just kind of go back, you know, I think that when you have people in leadership roles or inside of organizations and inside of decision-making, you know, in decision-making roles, or just more representation overall in TV, right? Like everything, every part of our life. I mean, I think it just sends a message that we aren't limited to one specific type of person, right? There's a variety. And if you don't understand, then you should be encouraged to ask, right? Or to clarify, instead of just assuming that you know the pronunciation of someone's last name, or, and I think that just goes back to like how in this assimilation, like, right, we have been denied our own voice, right? And that now we have to overcome that. And I think that like representation and seeing more people take the time to correct people on their pronunciation, or just to just their presence overall in these spaces, I think it just it encourages everybody else to learn, right, and to understand and to accept that people are different from themselves, and that instead of just assuming that this is the right way, that they should ask questions to better understand.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. That was really resonated with me. And, you know, I think to Annalisa's question, you know, like, how does it feel like to be like at the table, or like, you know, being maybe feeling that we're being invited to participate in work to give folks political cover. You know, that is something that I feel like I struggle with a lot, you know, to like try to understand, like, you know, well, what is my role here? And once I get to the table, sometimes like I'm invited to participate in, you know, like meetings and to talk about like how terrible the situation is for us. But then when the conversation switches to like solutions to the problems, then they turn to like a man, or like someone who's not a person of color, who's the expert. And that is for me always like very difficult and that's what I start to see, like, okay, now that's why I was invited, you know? And I think it's important with folks who are working with frontline communities and impacted people to also not just ask them to, you know, tell you about how terrible their situation is, but like, what do you want to happen? Someone, you know, when they like, what do you want to happen? Like, it's a really powerful question for people who never get to decide like what their lives are going to be, what their community is going to look like. You know, just to spend a little time thinking about that and unpacking that, and giving the space, the proper amount of time to be able to imagine, you know, because I feel like we're like here in our community, we're constantly putting out fires by bad actors, polluters, and all the rest of it, that it's an actual luxury to be able to have the time to pause and just to envision a different kind of community. There's just not enough hours in the day. So I think when we work with planners and planning organizations, you know, to very much in the front end, you know, set those boundaries and like the expectations of like what the role of the folks who are coming to the table is going to be, and that we want them invited to be part of those solutions, not just to, people use the word poverty pimping all the time, you know, and that's something that I feel is very much does happen. I just wanted to mention that.
No, that's actually perfect, because that brings us to sort of the final question that I've prepared before we turn it over to the audience. So if folks want to start putting their questions in the Q&A, now's the time while I sort of tee up this last question. And that's really about the future that we're trying to build, right? We've spent a lot of time in this hour that has gone by extremely fast, talking about the things that we don't want, talking about sort of our own experiences. So let's talk about the visions that you all have and that have been put forth by community residents for the future. You all have roots on the Southeast side, so feel free to speak specifically to the East side, but we're also dealing with much broader issues. And we know, right, that the diaspora extends like far beyond even this city, even this country. So I'm curious to hear from all of you what you see as sort of the vision for the future and what keeps you moving.
I can go. I get asked this question a lot, and it's always so hard for me to answer because I'm always in constant reaction mode and not proactive mode. And I think that's my answer, is that I want to get to a point where generations after me can have these proactive visions for like a green economic corridor or accessibility and acknowledgement. You know, I'm a special needs mom, so there's a lot of lack of resources for my son. And so, you know, like tying the pollution that the Southeast Siders face to some of, you know, the developmental disabilities that occur in our children, I would like to see acknowledgement of that and accessibility for those children. That's just my personal, what I would like to see for the community. But it's an awesome place to live, and that's why I've been here. I'm raising a 4th generation East Sider. My dad's like, it's lakefront property. That's all he ever told me. But it's so true. It's so beautiful. I would love to see U.S. Steel built up with a community vision. It's, you know, so many acreage of land, and it's lakefront property. So there's amazing things that can happen here.
Yeah, I also wanted to add that in my vision for the future, I was joking about with a mentor of mine that we want to work ourselves out of a job, that the only community organizing job that should be existing is event planning and, you know, block parties happening, not around let's have a petition to get rid of a horrible polluter out of our neighborhood, things like that. And I definitely envision an East Side where, you know, exactly what like a green future looks like. Community gardens and happy people everywhere and clean air and a CTA line that we can just hop on a block away from my house, things like that. Yeah.
Anybody else like to respond before we turn it over.
Yeah, I think about this. This keeps me up at night, every single night. And I think that I feel, at least in my current role, right, a tremendous amount of responsibility that I carry in just ensuring that we build good policy, and that we address these things. And I think, I always have to pause first and just sort of acknowledge like the role that, and just going back to Olga's point about, just the role that communities have played in the decision-making process, and really just acknowledging like how systems of oppression and just like some of these unfair power dynamics and just structural racism has led to these outcomes, especially within the context of water, right? Like, before I came back to the city of Chicago, I worked in the Bronx for over a decade, and the community that I worked in had 13 CSO outfalls just in that community alone, in one peninsula in the South Bronx, right? And so when you think about, just water quality, right? And just thinking about just like the abundance of issues related to water, I just always think back to just that moment and that work and how critical it was, but also just like how the decision-making power, right? Or just the dynamics of decision-making led to just like this really poor outcome for the community. And then I always just think about like, how do we overcome that? We have to acknowledge that those things exist. And I think, as Olga already mentioned, right, we have to work really hard to overcome them and be more intentional of how the decision-making process is structured to be able to just create better outcomes overall. And so I think about like, not only for the Southeast side, I actually don't live on the Southeast side anymore. But I do think about, how we make sure that communities have power. How do we make sure that communities are free from this type of oppression? And then I think about like, just how do we create equitable access to resources, right? So that we can improve our environment and create more sustainable outcomes for people.
Great, thank you for that. I'm gonna take us to the Q&A. Somehow we ended up with only 12 minutes left, so we may only get to a couple of these, but I just wanna highlight for folks that the chat function is disabled, but the Q&A function of the Zoom meeting is where you should put your questions. We will not get to all of them, but you are all welcome to follow up with us. If you wanna send emails to me, I'll provide my contact information at the end of this call so I can field questions beyond our hour together. So I'm going to go to some of the questions here. I'm getting a few about how people can get involved even if they're not from the Southeast side. Like what does solidarity look like for some of the local efforts that you all have spoken to today?
This is Olga. I think that anywhere, like if you're on the north side and the west side and you throw a rock, there's going to be an environmental justice issue. That working with your neighbors and creating awareness is really important, and then and to work in the neighborhoods that where you live or you reside, and then just being there. Like solidarity is really important once you have your block organized, and then there's actions or things that are happening to show up, to prioritize, echoing what residents and I'm so sorry, residents and those communities are saying. When you have privilege, to use that privilege, not to come up with your own solutions, but to really bolster the work that's already happening on the ground, I think is really important.
Great. I have another question here, more about your personal and educational backgrounds. We're told that education is the way forward. You all have very impressive credentials beyond, titles and resume type stuff, but truly the work that you do and many of the things that insights you've shared today. But I'm wondering if you can share a little bit either about your personal role models or what has brought you to where you are, that can provide a model for the next generation.
This is Gina. I was a first generation college student and a commuter student. My dad forbid me to go out of state, so I went to DePaul, and 10 years later I went to Roosevelt University to get my master's. I made a lot of mistakes in between that bachelor's and that master's, and I think that's what you need to do. And I've been so rooted in this community, and I knew I always wanted to give back to it because that's how I was raised. My dad's a church organist in the neighborhood. He's probably played everyone's funeral and baptismal and quinceañera. So I think I just sort of modeled after my parents, like giving back to the community. It's like their third love. It's also mine.
Great. And then for what I think will probably be our last question, I'm going to direct to Angela, but others are, of course, welcome to chime in. And it's around stormwater, both you mentioned CSOs, combined sewage overflows. I almost totally lost that in the middle of this webinar just now.
I apologize for using acronyms. I
so many acronyms.
For clarifying to people.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about your vision for cleaning up definitely CSOs, which are very gross, but also for addressing flood and stormwater issues.
Right. You know, I think a couple of things related to that issue. It is going to take an incredible amount of work and a huge network of people to get that done beyond the city, right? And I think that we have the privilege here in Chicago of being able to work with such a wide range of technical experts and people that are committed, you know, just through nonprofit organizations on supporting the work of the city in related to stormwater. You know, I think of groups like CNT and Marcela Bandikinen, who's another excellent Latina that I'm just going to give a shout out to just because we are just celebrating Latina women in this space and just some of her work that she's done and her team in stormwater management. And there's numerous examples of people that are leading this effort. You know, this is speaking to one of a serious issue that we have about green infrastructure. This is speaking to a serious issue that we have just around rising lake levels. This is a serious issue that I think we need to address related to climate change. And we'll have to do this in a number of different ways. I think that the important thing is that we have to find funding for additional infrastructure. I think we have to work in partnership with the Park District, right, to redefine what our lakefront looks like, right? I know that there is a lot of interest in, you know, and you've seen that over time, right? And just creating new spaces that incorporate natural elements, right? To really capture some of the stormwater and just incorporating green infrastructure. And I think that we have to continue the work that has been done on the river to really think about stormwater capture, to think about green infrastructure, and to also utilize that as a way to sort of align ourselves and uplift sort of the vision that people have for their communities, right? This is a moment in our time, in time where we can say, you know, we have these green infrastructure priorities as a city, but this is also a way in which we could sort of advance the vision that people have for their communities, and how do we connect those two, right? And not plan over people, and think more meaningfully about, you know, what are the outcomes that the organizers are looking for in terms of recreation space, in terms of just access overall, and how they can utilize the river or the waterfront as a space that's for the community. So how do we integrate that into our flood protection measures, into our stormwater capture to be able to advance that? And then I think that urban flooding, right, is a problem. And I think we've seen just some of the more recent research that just suggests that it is disproportionately impacting Black and Brown community. And while it's a problem citywide, right, every single ward has has issues related to urban flooding, but we know that there is a disproportionate impact, and we certainly have a role in determining how to create better outcomes and how to create solutions that help address that at the home level as well. And that is something that we are pursuing funding to work on.
I know we're running out of time, but there are some really, really great questions in the chat, and there's a theme that I'm seeing. So, and I just, Annalisa, will you give me like 30 seconds just to address some of that?
I will give you 30 seconds, and then I'll give them a way to continue the conversation. Go ahead.
I mean, this is beautiful to see so many folks asking like how they can support impacted communities, and particularly issues that are happening on the Southeast side. And I think that there's probably a lot of folks also who are participants who are involved in some way or another in the work around, you know, issues with water, air quality, or planning organizations. And I think when you're doing that work, and to stop and pause sometimes and to look around the table and to see who's missing. You know, we have a strong indigenous groups here in the city of Chicago. We have the Cheyenne Nations Youth Council. We have the American Indian Center. We have a lot of groups on the south side in Little Village, McKinley Park, that are shout out to folks from the Chicago Environmental Justice Network. And I think that there's a lot of folks who are ready to talk about solutions and are just not giving that opportunity. And I think that is one of the key ways to be a good ally, and to make sure that people are not speaking for those communities, but that people from those communities can speak for themselves, and to be given those opportunities.
Thank you. That is the perfect note to end on. I would like to invite folks, if you did not have your question answered, and there are many of you, please do find us. We are at www, as if you need that still, .greatlakes.org. On Twitter, we are at A4, the number 4, GL. And I believe if you found us from an email, you should be able to respond to it, to get in touch with us, to follow up. Our amazing panelists from NRDC, Illinois Youth Climate Movement, City of Chicago, we're all continuing to do this work every day, and would be happy to engage further. So just to close us out, I would also like to share a quote with you all that I think speaks to the heart of this conversation. And it is, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And that comes from Aboriginal activist groups in Queensland, Australia from the 1970s, and I think speaks to the spirit of much of our work and yours. So thank you all so much for being with us, and please get in touch. Thank you. Thanks to our amazing panelists.
Thank you.